Michael Faraday. He had discovered cold, and if he had ever thought about commercializing this idea, his name could have been written among the richest people in history. But he had absolutely no such ambition. Later on, other names, entrepreneurs, would build upon these ideas, making enormous fortunes while also bringing these magnificent discoveries to humanity. Still, for artificial coal to enter our homes, a little more time was needed. Strange as it may sound, in order to cool the food in our homes and stock supplies in our freezers for winter, we first had to understand something else very well: heat. Without fully understanding heat, we could never truly understand cold. Welcome to the next chapter of the story. From the early 1800s onward, steam began to transform the world and quite literally acted as a locomotive, driving the Industrial Revolution forward at full speed. There was an unusual coincidence here though. This time, science would follow technology. First came technology, steam engines, and only afterward did people attempt to understand them better, trying to make them more efficient. In doing so, they would eventually give birth to one of the most fundamental fields of physics. This was all tied to the transformation of energy, or more precisely, energy transfer. And this development, just as I mentioned in the previous video, would lead to some of the most important inventions of modern life: refrigeration and purification. In other words, thermodynamics would provide humanity with cheap energy and cheap fuel. Along with that, it would make access to cheaper, more abundant, and unspoiled food much easier. As a result, the world's population would begin to explode. Life expectancy would increase. A level of comfort unimaginable just 200 years ago would emerge. Eventually, thermodynamics would lay the foundations for where we ourselves are headed: quantum mechanics and general relativity. That's why after taking a general look at thermodynamics, heat, and entropy in our entropy video, we now need to spend more time on them in greater detail and with broader scope. As we mentioned, steam power turned countries like England into incredible superpowers, and as always, nations that fell behind this technology and modern technology in general rapidly began to lag behind economically, militarily, and culturally. France was one of those countries. But a young man was deeply saddened by the state of his country. Deep down, he wanted his nation to be strong against England and other rising superpowers. We're talking about Sadi Carnot. In his very short life, this young man, coming from a family with a military background and driven by strong patriotism, devoted all his time to understanding how steam engines worked. Thanks to this determination and ambition, he would later be remembered as the father of thermodynamics, one of the most fundamental fields of physics. Thermodynamics, setting aside technical definitions, is in its simplest form the study of all types of energy in the universe. From the smallest microscopic organisms to massive celestial bodies hidden in the depths of space, it connects everything. And with the help of a few laws, it fulfills the very purpose of science, explaining these relationships simply. Thermodynamics is generally thought to have 3 laws, but in reality it has 4. Let's briefly recall them. First, the 0th law of thermodynamics. It has a strange name because it has a strange story. This law is so fundamental that scientists initially thought it didn't even need to be written down, but it was so essential and unavoidable that it was later included. Since the other 3 laws had already been defined and this one formed their foundation, it was named the 0th law rather than the 4th. It states, if 2 systems are each in thermal equilibrium with a third system, then they are in thermal equilibrium with each other. In short, objects in contact exchange heat, and after some time they reach thermal equilibrium, ending up at the same temperature. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. If a system gains energy, that energy must come from somewhere outside. This is why your electricity bill increases when you run the air conditioner. In short, the first law is about the amount of energy and its conservation. The second law of thermodynamics explains the quality of energy, how much of it can be converted into useful work. It tells us that processes don't occur in just any direction, but in a specific one. Most importantly, it says that energy always tends towards self-destruction. High potential energy naturally transforms into other forms with lower concentration. In other words, the second law states that events occur in a way that increases entropy, that is, in a direction where usable energy decreases. Everything in the universe obeys this law. It has to. Often summarized as everything tends towards disorder, this doesn't need to be interpreted too philosophically. Yes, it clearly tells us that everything has an end. It points directly to the concept of heat death, which we'll talk about later, the ultimate end of everything. It also tells us this: no matter what you do, you can never convert all energy into useful work. A portion is always used to maintain the system's internal structure. The entropy of the universe is constantly increasing. This means that over time, both energy and matter become less capable of doing useful work. When we make tea for breakfast, we may slow entropy down a bit, but eventually everything will fall victim to it. The simplest example is this: nothing in the universe heats itself up spontaneously without an external energy source. Finally, the third law of thermodynamics states something very clear. At absolute zero, entropy is constant. But as we mentioned, reaching absolute zero is practically impossible, so this law also implies that absolute zero itself is unattainable. That's of course a topic for another video. All of these laws emerge from people trying to understand technology. When Sadi Carnot examined steam engines, he initially thought that heat simply circulated within the engine, producing mechanical work. Heat wasn't being consumed or destroyed, it was just moving around, and work emerged as a result. He likened it to water mills. The higher the water falls from, the more mechanical work is produced. Steam engines worked in much the same way, except here, the height was the temperature difference. The greater the difference between the hot and cold parts of the engine, the more work it could produce. And since heat always flows from hot to cold, continuous work could be generated in a cycle. William Thomson, later known as Lord Kelvin, was fascinated by Carnot's ideas. The notion that the movement of heat could produce work was incredible. But later he encountered the ideas of James Joule, and his thinking had to evolve. As we discussed in our energy conservation video, Joule didn't completely reject Carnot's ideas. He refined them. He made a revolutionary claim. Heat doesn't just produce mechanical energy. Heat itself is mechanical energy. Mechanical motion, mechanical energy, all of that, they were all just different forms of the same thing: energy. Thomson would later gather, simplify, and formalize all these ideas into the thermodynamic laws we know today, and the world would never be the same. Refrigeration emerged from this understanding. First, ice-making facilities appeared in neighborhoods and towns. Over time, refrigerators entered our homes, much to the delight of electricity companies. Soon after, Willis Carrier, while trying to solve a problem for a popular American magazine called Judge, would invent air conditioning. The problem was simple. When the air was hot, the ink on the magazine pages would run. By controlling temperature and therefore humidity, Carrier solved the issue. Air conditioners would first make life easier in factories and movie theaters, and eventually enter our homes, creating a new sense of comfort. In short, humanity learned that energy was simply the same thing in different forms. Then we learned that energy and matter are the same thing. Step by step, we moved closer to a theory of everything. Perhaps one day we'll learn that absolutely everything is just different manifestations of a single phenomenon. Who knows? But the story of cold continues. The challenges it opened and the doors it unlocked afterwards are extraordinary. Thanks to this journey, we would explore the depths of space and at the same time dive into the folds of our brains, our cells, atoms, and even subatomic particles. With ultra-cold technologies, our journey towards superconductors, quantum computers, and beyond continues. This route is our route. Until the next stop. As always, until we meet again, I'm glad you're here. Much love.